the elves and the stone of eternal light. In the hush of twilight, Garrick wandered deeper into the forest, his rough hands brushing against moss-covered trunks and his boots sinking into damp, unyielding earth. He was a miner by trade, a dwarf from the foothills, where rocks told old tales. But this place, this ancient forest, was different. Here, the very air seemed heavy with secrets, as if the trees themselves leaned in to whisper of the things they'd seen and kept hidden in their rings. The dimming sky spilled a faint blue light through gaps in the branches, casting an eerie glow over the roots and stones. Garrick had no map for this part of the forest, nor a purpose save for curiosity's quiet tugging, leading him ever onward. And then, as the last glimmer of sunlight slipped below the horizon, he saw it. A soft glow, unmistakable and alluring, in the distance. He moved toward it, parting ferns and brushing aside branches until he emerged into a small clearing bathed in a pale, shimmering light. At the center of the clearing, nestled between twisted roots, lay the source of that light. It was a stone, round and perfectly smooth, resting on a bed of moss as though the earth itself had raised it. This was not an ordinary rock, nor was it a gem he'd seen in any mountain vein. The stone's glow was gentle, unbreakable, as if it held the light of 1,000 stars bound within. He knelt before it, entranced, his calloused fingers itching to touch it. But the closer he got, the heavier the air became, until it seemed to press down upon him, an invisible weight he could not explain. And in that moment, he knew. This was no mere artifact of nature. In the dim light, Garrick could see faint figures moving through the trees. Barely there, a flicker of silver here, a glint of watchful eyes there. His hand froze mere inches from the stone as figures emerged from the shadows, silent as mist. Elves. Garrick's heart quickened. He had heard tales of these beings, mysterious folk who kept to the ancient woods and whose wisdom was older than stone. They moved without sound, draped in robes that caught the light like woven moonbeams. Their faces serene but wary, their eyes sharp as winter stars. Leading them was one taller than the rest, her hair falling like silver water down her back, her gaze as piercing as a blade's edge. "You wander where a few tread," she said, her voice a melody too soft for the ears of mortals, but clear as the night air. "And you stand before the stone of eternal light. Do you know the power that lies within it?" Garrick, feeling both humbled and defiant, met her gaze. "I don't know what it is, only that it's unlike anything I've seen. And I've seen many things buried in earth and stone." A faint smile touched her lips, though it did not reach her eyes. "The earth you know is but one face of the world," she replied. "The stone you see is bound to this land, a gift to those who vow to protect the life that breathes beneath these trees." It is not a prize to be mined, nor a jewel to be claimed. Garrick clenched his fists, fighting the urge to explain himself, to defend his intentions. He was no thief. He had wandered here by chance, drawn to the light. But deep down, he knew this was no accident. Something within him had responded to the stone's call, pulling him through tangled roots and silent shadows. Then why let me find it at all? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The elf inclined her head. Perhaps you were meant to. But know this. The stone of eternal light belongs only to those who see not just its beauty, but its burden. If you would wield its power, you must bind yourself to the forest and all that lives within it. You must understand that its light is a promise, one that demands more than curiosity. Garrick lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a mantle. He had come in search of something, though he hadn't known what until now. But could he, a dwarf from the rugged hills, truly commit to something so vast, so entwined with life's unseen rhythms? As if sensing his doubt, the elven leader spoke again. There is a way to know if you are worthy. A test of heart and will. Should you choose to take it, the forest will show you its answer. Garrick looked back at the stone, its light pulsing softly, and felt the pull of something deeper than greed or ambition. A longing to understand, to touch the mystery it held. With a slow nod, he looked up at the elf. Tell me what I must do. A whisper of approval passed through the gathered elves, though their faces remained guarded. The leader's eyes softened, just a little, as if she glimpsed a sliver of hope in his answer. Then follow us, she said, turning back into the shadows. And so Garrick followed, leaving the stone of eternal light behind, unaware that the journey he had begun would bind him forever to the hidden heart of the ancient forest. The elven procession moved like shadows, weaving silently through the forest's undergrowth. Garrick, caught in their wake, struggled to match their fluid steps. Every now and then, a branch would snag at his tunic, or an unseen root would rise to trip him, as if the forest itself was testing his resolve. Ahead, the elven leader, Aelira, moved with effortless grace, her silver hair a beacon in the dark. The trees grew taller, their trunks widening until they seemed like ancient pillars supporting the sky. Strange flowers glowed faintly along the path, casting a soft, ethereal light that illuminated their way. Garrick could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him. Creatures of the night, perhaps, or simply the silent judgment of the forest itself. At last, they reached a grove where the trees arched together, their branches entwined in a natural dome, sealing them off from the world beyond. Aelira stopped, and the other elves formed a circle, their faces unreadable in the dim light. Garrick stood at the center, feeling the weight of their silent scrutiny. Aelira's voice broke the quiet, smooth and unyielding. You have come to the stone, a treasure few outsiders ever glimpse. But before you even consider it, you must understand its purpose, its price. She moved closer, her gaze piercing. The stone of eternal light is more than what you see. It is a heartbeat of this forest, a fragment of life bound to every leaf, every root, every creature that dwells here. Its light is eternal, yet it serves only those who dedicate themselves to the forest's care. Garrick shifted uneasily, meeting her gaze. And what of those who fail? He asked, his voice barely audible in the stillness. Those who fail. Aelira's voice softened, though her eyes remained steely. They are consumed by the light they sought to control. For the stone sees the truth of one's heart, and it tolerates no selfish desire. The forest offers its gifts only to those who give in return, those who are willing to protect without question. Her words echoed in Garrick's mind, stirring something deep and unexpected within him. This was no simple trial, no casual test of his curiosity. He would need to surrender something he hadn't realized he possessed. His own heart's ambition, his claim to self. One of the other elves stepped forward, a tall figure with dark hair and an expression both somber and stern. Understand this, dwarf, he said. The light of the stone is not a weapon, nor a prize. It is a promise, and if you are to bear its power, you must bind yourself to it, body and soul. Garrick met the elf's gaze, resisting the urge to look away. He thought of the mines he had spent his life working in, the quiet depths he had called his own. The earth there had always felt solid, safe, a place where he understood the rules, the limits of his craft. But this forest, these creatures who spoke of magic as one would speak of the wind or the rain, this was a world apart, a realm that held no patience for the unworthy. Aelira gestured toward the trees that formed the grove's perimeter. Your test begins here. This forest holds its own dangers, its own needs. It will ask of you what you may not yet understand. But if you heed its call, if you prove yourself worthy, you will be granted the chance to touch the stone of eternal light. Her words lingered in the air like mist, and Garrick felt their weight settle on his shoulders. The quiet of the grove deepened, and he realized that the elves were waiting, not just for an answer, but for something more profound, a shift within him that even he wasn't certain he could muster. What must I do? He asked, his voice rough in the quiet. Help the forest, and it will show you, Aelira replied simply. She gestured with a slender hand, and an elven figure emerged from the shadows, holding something small and injured. A creature Garrick recognized as a forest hare, its fur matted with blood from a wound on its side. Aelira looked down at the creature, then back at Garrick. The forest's creatures, like this hare, are woven into the same tapestries as the stone. Protect them, heal them, as you would any precious treasure. Your journey through the forest begins now. She placed the hare gently into his arms, and Garrick felt the warm, fragile weight of the creature against his chest. Its small eyes flickered, looking up at him with a kind of trust he wasn't certain he deserved. The elves, their task given, faded back into the shadows, leaving him alone in the grove with the wounded animal and the gathering darkness. As he examined the hare's wound, he realized the enormity of what lay before him. The forest's life was not just something to be seen or admired, but something to be cared for, something bound to him by the weight of a promise he hadn't yet spoken. He felt the forest around him, alive and breathing, a vast and ancient presence that asked nothing but offered everything in return. In that quiet grove, as he tended to the small, struggling creature in his arms, Garrick began to understand the elven warning. The stone's light was not merely a glow, but a reminder, a promise of the life he would need to protect, a vow he was beginning to make in the silence of his heart. And as he worked, the trees seemed to lean in, watching, waiting, as if the forest itself held its breath, gauging his every move. The forest's embrace was dense and silent, pressing in on Garrick as he carried the wounded hare through paths he had never before tread. Shadows stretched longer, and the sky, barely visible through the tangled canopy above, had faded to a deep, inky blue. Only the soft, pulsing glow of strange luminescent fungi offered him any guidance. In his arms, the hare stirred weakly, a reminder of the fragile life he held, and of the responsibility that had been laid upon him. He knew he could not falter. To save the creature was not only an act of mercy, but a test of his heart, a silent promise to the ancient forest that he would hold all life within it sacred. As he walked, he felt the weight of the forest's watchful gaze, as though each tree, each leaf, bore witness to his every step. He came to a stream, its waters dark and slow, slipping quietly through moss-covered stones. Kneeling beside it, he dipped his fingers into the cool water and gently pressed them to the hare's wound, washing away the dirt and dried blood. The hare winced, a tiny whimper escaping its mouth, and Garrick murmured soothing words, his voice soft against the silence. For all his years working stone and earth, he had never felt as delicate as he did now, tending to a creature so small, so vulnerable. The wound was deeper than he had thought, a gash likely left by a predator's claw. He looked around, realizing that he had nothing. No poultice, no bandages, not even a scrap of cloth. And yet, as he sat there, searching for a solution, the forest seemed to respond to his need. The bark of a nearby tree caught his eye, its rough surface etched with lines of sap, thick and golden. Garrick recalled the stories he had heard, the old knowledge passed down by elders who still believed in the magic of the wild. Carefully, He scraped some of the sap and pressed it gently over the hare's wound, creating a seal that would protect it until it healed. The hare shivered, but its breathing steadied, and a faint pulse of warmth seemed to flow through Garrick, as though the forest itself acknowledged his act. Hours passed as he tended to the creature, his hands moving with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. And as he worked, he felt something within him shift, as if a new understanding was taking root. The hare's life, fragile and fleeting, was bound to the life of the forest, to the trees that provided shade, the river that offered water, the earth that held it all. And now, his own life felt woven into that same tapestry, a part of the silent, endless cycle of life and death. In the stillness, he became aware of another presence. Slowly he looked up, meeting the gaze of a stag standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Its antlers rose like branches, and his eyes held a depth that seemed to pierce through him, seeing not just his actions, but the very intent within his heart. Garrick held his gaze unflinching, feeling the weight of the silent communion. After a long moment, the stag dipped its head, a silent acknowledgement, and vanished back into the shadows. Garrick released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The test, he knew, was not merely to heal a wound, but to prove that he understood the bond that the stone demanded. It was a bond forged not through possession or control, but through respect, through reverence for all that lived. The hare's eyes fluttered open, its gaze meeting his with a quiet trust. Carefully, Garrick set the creature down on the forest floor, watching as it wobbled to its feet, and, after a moment's hesitation, scampered into the underbrush. He felt a pang of longing, a strange sense of loss as the creature disappeared, but also a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had helped it live, a simple act of kindness, yet one that felt monumental beneath the shadowed canopy. As he rose to his feet, he felt the forest around him shift, a subtle stirring in the air, as if it were acknowledging his effort. The path back to the grove unfolded before him, illuminated by a faint glimmer that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the trees. Following the light, he retraced his steps, feeling the forest's presence all around him. And this time, it felt different, not as an observer, but as something he belonged to. Something that held him as gently as he had held the hare. When he returned to the grove, the elves were waiting, their silent forms blending seamlessly with the trees. Aelira stepped forward, her expression softened, though her eyes held the same piercing scrutiny. "You have passed the first test, dwarf," she said, her voice a quiet song in the stillness. "But know that the forest sees deeper than flesh, deeper than words. The light of the stone does not belong to any one being. It belongs to those who understand that it must be given back, that it is only as eternal as the life it sustains." Garrick nodded, the weight of her words settling within him. a quiet acceptance growing in his heart. He had touched something more profound than he could ever have imagined. A promise not just to the forest, but to the life that bound them all. And as he stood there, beneath the shadowed canopy and the watchful eyes of the elves, he knew that he was ready to take the next step in his journey, whatever it might demand. Garrick's return to the grove was met with an air of quiet approval. The elves, gathered in a silent circle, observed him with a new respect. Though their expressions remained veiled, their faces serene as untouched water. Aelira, their leader, stepped forward, her silver gaze assessing him with the keen awareness of one who sees beyond the surface. He felt as if she could see into the very depths of his soul. "Your heart has passed the forest's trial," she said, her voice soft, yet resonant. "The forest recognizes your respect for its life, your willingness to give without thought of return. But there is one final step before the stone may reveal itself to you fully. A bond must be made, a promise bound by more than words." Garrick's heart quickened, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions he dared not ask. Instead, he nodded, feeling a gravity within himself, a readiness that had grown slowly through the night's journey. This was a path he had chosen without knowing. Now, he was prepared to accept whatever lay at its end. Aelira beckoned him forward, guiding him to the center of the grove, where the stone of eternal light lay upon a bed of soft moss, its glow pulsing faintly as if aware of his presence. The light was softer than he remembered, no longer an overwhelming brilliance, but a quiet, inviting warmth. Garrick felt a pull, a gentle urging, as if the stone itself were calling to him. "The stone," Aelira began, her voice hushed, "holds within it the light of countless lives. Trees, rivers, creatures of the air and earth. It is a gift of the forest, a fragment of life's essence. To touch it is to accept a promise, an oath that cannot be broken, for it binds you to this land and all that dwells within it." Garrick swallowed, the weight of her words settling within him, like roots deep in the soil. He understood now. This was not merely an act of touching, but a merging of his own life with the life of the forest, an acceptance of its joys, its sorrows, its endless cycles. He knelt beside the stone, his fingers trembling as he reached toward it. The air around him felt alive, as if holding its breath, and he could feel the watchful eyes of the elves, the silent presence of the trees, the very heartbeat of the forest thrumming beneath him. When his hand touched the stone, a warmth blossomed beneath his palm, spreading up his arm and through his chest, until he felt as though he were glowing from within. Images surged through his mind, ancient trees standing tall beneath endless skies, rivers carving paths through rocky land, creatures small and swift, and the patient, enduring earth that held them all. He saw the hair he had healed, its small heart beating in rhythm with his own, and he felt the presence of the stag, regal and knowing, a silent guardian of the forest. Each life, each heartbeat wove itself into him, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the forest began. He was part of it now, a thread in an ancient tapestry bound to the forest's past, present, and future. As he withdrew his hand, the stone's light faded to a soft glow, and Garrick felt a new strength within himself, not of muscle but of spirit. He looked up at Aelira, and for the first time, her face softened into something close to a smile. "You are now bound to the stone," she said, her voice gentle. "Its light is yours, as long as your heart remains true to your vow. But remember, this is no idle promise. To betray it is to betray the life within you." Garrick nodded, a solemn understanding reflected in his eyes. He felt the stone's energy within him, a quiet pulse that resonated with the forest's own rhythm. The weight of his oath settled on him, not as a burden, but as a gift, a new purpose, one that transcended his own desires and ambitions. As he rose to his feet, he felt the forest around him draw closer. The trees, the shadows, the unseen creatures all seeming to acknowledge his newfound place among them. The bond was sealed, a silent promise etched into his heart, a light that would guide him through the darkness. The elves stepped back, their figures melting into the shadows, leaving him alone with Aelira. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light as a falling leaf, yet grounding him in the reality of his vow. "Go, Garrick," she said softly. "Walk the paths of this forest not as a stranger, but as one of its guardians. You are bound to us now, to the stone, to all that lives here. Protect it well." With those final words, she too vanished into the trees, leaving him standing alone. The stone's glow still pulsing faintly behind him. He turned, feeling the weight of his oath settle within him, a solemn promise that he would carry not only through these woods, but through the endless journey of his life. He walked away from the grove, his heart now bound to the silent, watchful forest and the light that would forever connect him to all that dwelled within. The forest lay quiet beneath the dawn, the sky a pale blush filtering through the dense canopy above. Garrick walked slowly, feeling the shift in the air around him, the subtle awareness of each leaf, each rustle of creatures waking to the morning. It was as though the land itself had opened to him, revealing its hidden rhythms, its soft whispers that most would never hear. With every step, he felt the presence of the stone of eternal light within him, a quiet glow pulsing in his chest, resonant with the life he had sworn to protect. The bond had rooted itself deep, binding him to the forest in ways he had never imagined. Where once he had felt like an outsider, a wanderer among ancient trees, he now moved with a sense of belonging, as if the land had accepted him as one of its own. As he walked, he came upon a river, its waters clear and cold, catching the early light. He knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink, and as the cool water touched his lips, he felt a strange sensation, like a song thrumming beneath the surface. It was the life of the river, he realized. The countless creatures, the silent stones beneath, all woven together in a delicate, eternal dance. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the river's life wash over him, grounding him in his oath. The faint crunch of leaves alerted him, and he opened his eyes to see Aelira standing beside him. Her gaze soft but intent, a quiet respect in her eyes. "Do you feel it now?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the river's murmur. "The connection to all that lives here?" Garrick nodded, his hand resting on the earth beside the river. "It's like I can hear them in a way. The river, the trees, even the small creatures hidden in the shadows." Aelira smiled, her expression touched by something ancient, a wisdom that had known countless lifetimes. "That is the essence of the stone's light. It does not simply glow, it binds. Those who carry its light must carry the weight of all that lives within the forest, for its power lies in its unity with the land." Garrick looked out over the river, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He knew now that the stone's light was not a gift for the ambitious, nor a tool for those who sought power. It was a responsibility, a promise to protect something vast and fragile, a bond that would endure beyond his own life. "Aelira," he asked, his voice thoughtful, "what happens if the bond is broken? If someone fails to keep the promise?" A shadow passed over her face, and she glanced away, as if remembering something distant and painful. "The light turns dark," she murmured. "Those who betray the bond are consumed by it, their hearts darkened, lost. The forest does not tolerate selfishness. To wield the stone's power, one must be selfless, or risk being swallowed by the very light they sought to control." Garrick felt a chill pass over him, the weight of her words a stern reminder of the path he had chosen. There would be no room for pride, no space for personal gain. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to the forest, to the creatures that dwelled within its shadows and its light. Aelira placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression gentle. "But I see no darkness in you, Garrick. You have proven yourself worthy, and the forest has accepted you as one of its guardians. Your journey may take you far, but this bond will remain with you, a light that cannot be extinguished." With a final nod, she stepped back, leaving him alone by the river. Garrick sat in the quiet that followed, feeling the weight and wonder of his eternal oath settle within him. He knew now that his life would never be the same, that the bond he had forged was a path with no return. Yet he felt no regret, only a deep, quiet purpose that filled him with a light of its own. He rose, looking out over the forest that stretched before him, vast and endless, a world that now felt like home. As he walked away from the river, he could feel the life around him pulsing, a quiet song that followed him through the trees, whispering of the oath he had taken and the light that now lived within him. The sun rose higher, casting dappled light through the leaves, and Garrick walked on, carrying the stone's promise within him, bound forever to the forest's silent, eternal embrace. And in his heart, the light of the stone glowed softly, an unbreakable bond, a promise as vast and enduring as the ancient land itself.